Blood, money, and power usually dictate how a ruthless man reacts when publicly disrespected. Drop a $15,000 bottle of vintage Burgundy onto a cartel boss's custom-tailored Brioni suit, and you expect a funeral, not a job offer. Utter silence fell over the Michelin-starred dining room that night. Bodyguards subtly reached for concealed weapons beneath their jackets. Waitstaff held their breath, waiting for the execution. Instead, Dominic Rossi did the unthinkable. He smiled. What happened next wasn't a fairy tale. It was a cold, calculated trap that dragged an innocent waitress into a brutal underworld war. Here is how one spilled glass changed absolutely everything. L'Epicure was not a restaurant for the casually wealthy. It was a sanctuary for the untouchable. Nestled deep in the heart of Manhattan's Tribeca district, behind an unmarked frosted glass door, it catered exclusively to politicians, hedge fund titans, and men who ruled the city from the shadows. Clara Hayes knew the rules of the floor perfectly. Be invisible, be silent, and never, under any circumstances, make eye contact with the VIPs seated at corner booth number 4. Clara was 24, running on 4 hours of sleep and surviving entirely on espresso and sheer desperation. She lived in a cramped, mold-scented apartment in Astoria, drowning under the crushing weight of a $90,000 medical and gambling debt left behind by her estranged older brother, Caleb. The debt wasn't owed to a bank. It was owed to Arthur Callahan, a brutal loan shark operating out of the Brooklyn dockyards. Clara had exactly 3 weeks to deliver the next installment of $10,000, or Callahan's men would start breaking bones. Tonight, the tension in the restaurant's stainless steel kitchen was suffocating. The maitre d', a high-strung Frenchman named Richard, was sweating profusely, pacing between the prep stations. "Flawless service tonight. I want absolutely flawless service," Richard hissed, his voice trembling as he adjusted his silk tie. Dominic Rossi just walked through the front doors. Even Clara, who actively avoided the news, felt a cold shiver trace the line of her spine. Dominic Rossi was not merely a wealthy patron. He was the undisputed head of the Rossi Syndicate, a man whose family controlled half the illegal shipping imports on the eastern seaboard. Rumors surrounding Rossi were dark and vicious. It was whispered that he had once dismantled a rival syndicate's leadership without raising his voice or dirtying his own hands. He was a ghost who operated with terrifying precision. Clara grabbed her silver tray, her knuckles turning white. She was assigned to Section A, which unfortunately encompassed Booth 4. As she pushed through the swinging velvet doors into the dimly lit dining room, the atmosphere was thick. The usual low murmur of elite conversation was muted. Every patron in the room was hyper-aware of the dark-haired, broad-shouldered man sitting in the corner booth. Dominic Rossi wore a charcoal 3-piece suit that cost more than Clara's annual salary. He sat with a terrifying stillness, flanked by 2 massive men whose eyes scanned the room like predatory hawks. "Table 4, Richard whispered harshly into Clara's ear as she passed him. "The Chateau Haut-Briand, 1989. Decant it. Pour it. Do not speak unless spoken to." Clara nodded, her throat entirely dry. She retrieved the ancient, dust-covered bottle from the sommelier. Its price tag was a staggering $15,000. Her hands, usually steady from years of carrying heavy trays, betrayed a slight tremor as she approached the table. Dominic Rossi was deep in conversation with a nervous-looking city alderman. His voice was a low, gravelly baritone, smooth but laced with an undeniable edge of menace. He didn't even look up as Clara approached. "Excuse me, gentlemen," Clara murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. She placed the crystal decanter on the table. She uncorked the vintage wine with practiced precision, the cork pulling free with a soft, satisfying pop. She began to pour the dark, ruby-red liquid into the massive crystal glass positioned at Rossi's right hand. It was a flawless pour, until the alderman, gesturing frantically to emphasize a point to Rossi, sharply threw his arm backward. His elbow collided violently with Clara's wrist. Time seemed to fracture, slowing down to a torturous crawl. Clara watched in paralyzed horror as the heavy crystal decanter slipped from her grip. It didn't shatter on the floor. Instead, it tipped forward, striking the edge of the mahogany table, sending a massive, violent wave of dark red wine directly into Dominic Rossi's lap and splashing up across the pristine silk of his pale grey shirt. The red stain bloomed instantly, looking terrifyingly like fresh blood. The crash of the decanter against the table echoed like a gunshot. Instantly, the ambient jazz music playing softly through the hidden speakers seemed to fade into nothingness. The clinking of silverware ceased. Dozens of highly influential people froze mid-bite, turning their heads toward the corner booth. The silence that descended upon L'Epicure was heavy, suffocating, and absolute. Rossi's bodyguards reacted with terrifying speed. The man on Rossi's left, a heavily scarred enforcer named Silvio, was on his feet in a fraction of a second, his massive hand plunging inside his tailored jacket, resting firmly on the grip of a concealed firearm. He stepped aggressively toward Clara, his eyes wide with violent intent. Clara couldn't breathe. The air had been entirely sucked from her lungs. She stared at the $15,000 worth of ruined vintage wine dripping from the edge of the table, pooling on the imported Persian rug, and soaking into the chest of the most dangerous man in New York. Clara started, her voice breaking completely. I am so incredibly sorry. Richard, the maitre d', materialized from the shadows like a bat, his face completely drained of color. He practically threw himself between Clara and the table, bowing so deeply he nearly hit his head on the mahogany. Mr. Rossi, I beg your forgiveness, Richard stammered, his accent thickening in his sheer panic. This is an absolute catastrophe. The restaurant will cover the cost of the suit, the wine, your entire evening. This girl is completely incompetent. She is fired immediately. Get out of my sight, Clara. Get out! Clara took a stumbling step backward, tears of pure terror finally pricking the corners of her eyes. Losing this job meant Callahan would come for her tomorrow. It was a death sentence. Silvio took another step forward, glaring at Clara. Nobody moves, he growled. Dominic Rossi hadn't moved a single muscle. He hadn't jumped up from the cold liquid. He hadn't cursed. He sat there, staring down at his ruined suit, the dark red liquid dripping from his cuffs. Slowly, deliberately, he picked up a stark white linen napkin and dabbed at his wrist. Then he lifted his head. His eyes locked onto Clara. They were a piercing, icy shade of slate grey. There was no rage in them. There was no fury. Instead, there was a sharp, calculating intensity that made Clara's blood run entirely cold. He studied her. He took in her frayed uniform collar, the dark circles under her eyes, and the cheap, scuffed orthopedic shoes she wore to survive 14-hour shifts. He raised one single hand, holding it up toward Richard and Silvio. It was a minuscule gesture, but it commanded absolute authority. Silvio froze instantly. Richard snapped his mouth shut, swallowing his panicked apologies. "You're firing her?" Rossi asked. His voice was unnervingly calm, echoing through the dead-silent restaurant. Yes, Mr. Rossi. Immediately. She will never step foot in this establishment again," Richard promised, sweating profusely. Rossi slowly stood up. He towered over the table, his imposing frame casting a long shadow across Clara. He pulled a fresh napkin from the center holder and wiped his hands. "Mistakes happen, Richard. Rossi said, his eyes never leaving Clara's. The alderman bumped her arm. I saw it. You saw it. The girl was collateral damage to this politician's erratic gesturing. The alderman sitting across the table went entirely pale, looking like he was about to be violently ill. Dominic, I swear to God, I didn't mean— Silence, Rossi interrupted softly. He looked back at Clara. What is your name? Clara, she whispered, her hands shaking so violently she had to clench them into fists at her sides. Clara Hayes. Rossi tilted his head slightly. The corner of his mouth twitched upward into a ghost of a smile. It wasn't a warm expression. It was the look of a grandmaster noticing a very specific pawn on a chessboard. Well, Clara Hayes, Rossi said smoothly, you are not fired. In fact, you are going to personally serve my table for the rest of the evening. Bring me a clean shirt from the manager's office. And bring another bottle of the Haut-Brion. Put it on the alderman's tab. He glanced sharply at Richard. If she is terminated, Richard, I will buy this restaurant tomorrow and burn it to the foundation with you inside it. Are we clear? Richard practically whimpered, nodding frantically. Crystal clear, Mr. Rossi. Rossi sat back down in his wine-soaked chair as if nothing had happened. Go on, Clara. He dismissed her softly. We have a long night ahead. The remaining 4 hours of Clara's shift were a waking nightmare. Every time she approached corner booth number 4, she felt the phantom crosshairs of a sniper rifle resting against her forehead. She served the second bottle of wine with hands that felt like lead. She brought their steaks, cleared their plates, and poured their digestives, all while Rossi engaged in hushed, intense negotiations with the now terrified alderman. Not once did Rossi acknowledge the massive stain on his trousers, nor did he offer Clara a single word of comfort. He merely watched her. Every time she turned her back, she could feel his slate-grey eyes tracking her movements, analyzing her like a complex piece of data. At 1 a.m., the restaurant finally emptied. Rossi and his men were the last to leave. As Rossi stood up, buttoning his jacket over the borrowed, ill-fitting white shirt from the manager's office, he dropped a thick, leather-bound checkbook onto the table. Clara approached to clear the final glasses. Beneath Rossi's empty crystal tumbler lay a thick stack of bills bound by a dark rubber band. It was a tip. She quickly calculated the thickness. It had to be at least $5,000 in crisp $100 bills. More than the money, however, was what lay beneath the stack of cash. A heavy, matte black business card with a single word printed in gold foil: tomorrow. Below it was an address in Brooklyn, right by the shipping yards. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. She stuffed the cash and the card into her apron, her mind racing. Why would a Mafia boss tip the girl who ruined his suit with enough money to pay off half her immediate debt? Why the address? By 2:30 a.m., Clara had changed out of her wine-splattered uniform and stepped out the heavy steel rear door of L'Epicure into the cold, rain-slicked alleyway. The air smelled of wet asphalt and rotting garbage. She pulled her thin coat tightly around her shoulders, eager to get to the subway. She only made it 10 steps before she realized the alley was blocked. Idling silently at the mouth of the alley was an entirely black Cadillac Escalade, its headlights off, the engine humming with a low, menacing vibration. Standing directly beneath the flickering orange glow of a street lamp was Silvio, the heavily scarred enforcer from the restaurant. He was smoking a cigarette, the cherry glowing fiercely in the dark. Clara froze. Her survival instinct screamed at her to turn around and run back into the restaurant, but another figure stepped out from the shadows behind her, cutting off her retreat. It was Rossi's other bodyguard. Silvio dropped his cigarette and crushed it beneath the heel of his leather shoe. He opened the heavy rear door of the Escalade. "Get in, Miss Hayes," Silvio grunted, his voice like grinding stones. "The boss wants a word." I have to go home. My shift is over," Clara said, her voice shaking despite her desperate attempt to sound brave. "It wasn't a request," Silvio replied, resting his hand on the open door. Realizing she had absolutely no choice, Clara forced her legs to move. She climbed into the dark, leather-scented interior of the SUV. The door slammed shut behind her with a heavy, terrifying thud, sealing her in darkness. Sitting across from her in the opulent rear cabin was Dominic Rossi. He had changed into a fresh, tailored black suit. The ambient light from the street lamp outside cast sharp shadows across his angular face. "You didn't run," Rossi noted quietly, pouring himself a glass of amber liquid from a small decanter built into the center console. "Most people would have left out the front door the second my back was turned." "I need the job," Clara whispered, clutching her purse to her chest like a shield. "Mr. Rossi, I don't understand. I apologized for the wine. I served you all night. If you're going to kill me, just get it over with." Rossi chuckled, a dark, humorless sound. "Kill you? Over a bottle of fermented grape juice and a piece of wool? I am a businessman, Clara. I do not waste resources on petty revenge." He reached beside him and picked up a thick manila folder. He tossed it onto the empty seat between them. "Open it," he commanded softly. With trembling hands, Clara reached for the folder and flipped it open. Her breath hitched in her throat. Inside were high-definition surveillance photographs. But they weren't of her. They were photos of her older brother, Caleb. The pictures showed Caleb walking out of an underground casino, meeting with shady figures in dim parking lots, and most damning of all, a ledger page showing a massive deficit. "Your brother, Caleb Hayes," Rossi said, his tone devoid of all emotion. "A degenerate gambler and a petty thief. A few months ago, he decided to siphon funds from a construction front managed by my syndicate. He stole exactly $90,000 before he vanished into thin air." Clara's world tilted on its axis. The debt, the loan shark. "Arthur Callahan," Clara breathed out, the horrific puzzle pieces snapping together in her mind. "Callahan is the loan shark hounding me. He told me Caleb borrowed the money from him." "Callahan works for me," Rossi corrected her smoothly. "He is one of my debt collectors. When your brother disappeared, Callahan went to the next of kin to recoup my losses." "You." Clara stared at the Mafia boss in absolute shock. "You knew who I was. The spill. You didn't fire me because you recognized me. I knew exactly who you were the moment you walked up to my table." Rossi leaned forward, his grey eyes pinning her in place. "The spilled wine was merely a fortunate accident that gave me an excuse to test your grace under extreme pressure. You didn't cry. You didn't beg. You stood your ground against my men." "What do you want from me?" Clara asked, a fresh wave of terror washing over her. "Your brother left a mess, Clara. A $90,000 mess. The cash I left on the table tonight is a down payment," Rossi said, swirling the liquor in his glass. "I don't want you to pay me back. I want you to work off your brother's debt." "I'm a waitress," she pleaded. "I don't know anything about your world. I can't hurt people." "I have plenty of men who can hurt people," Rossi replied, his gaze dropping to the floor before rising to meet hers again. "What I do not have is a clean, untraceable civilian with an immaculate record, no criminal ties, and access to the upper echelon of Manhattan's elite. You work at L'Epicure. You serve politicians, judges, and my rivals. You are entirely invisible to them. You are going to be my eyes and ears, Clara. You are going to be my spy." Rossi leaned back into the shadows of the cabin, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "Welcome to the family." Sleep was a luxury Clara Hayes could no longer afford. When the morning sun finally filtered through the cracked blinds of her Astoria apartment, it illuminated the stack of crisp $100 bills sitting on her cheap Formica kitchen table. $5,000, half of what she owed the loan shark, Arthur Callahan, to keep her brother's legs from being shattered. Yet, as Clara stared at the money, it felt less like a lifeline and more like a down payment on her soul. When she arrived at L'Epicure for her evening shift, the atmosphere had undergone a terrifying shift. Richard, the usually tyrannical maître d', who delighted in micromanaging the staff, refused to make eye contact with her. He didn't yell when she was 2 minutes late clocking in. He didn't inspect her uniform. In fact, he assigned her to the highly coveted private dining room, a soundproofed mahogany chamber reserved exclusively for billionaires, state senators, and men who required absolute secrecy. "You are on the VIP room tonight, Clara," Richard mumbled, his eyes fixed firmly on his clipboard. "Whatever they need, you provide. Do not ask me for permission." Clara knew exactly why she had been promoted. Rossi had made his move. At exactly 7 o'clock, a heavily built man with a freshly pressed suit and a cauliflower ear walked into the service hallway near the kitchen. It was Silvio. The kitchen staff parted around him, like water around a stone, suddenly finding immense interest in chopping vegetables. Silvio didn't speak. He simply walked past Clara and seamlessly slipped a heavy, matte black Mont Blanc pen into the pocket of her apron. "Press the clip twice," Silvio murmured, as he brushed past, his voice barely a breath. "Leave it on the table when you pour the water. Retrieve it when you clear the dessert. Do not fail." Clara's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She retreated to the staff bathroom, locked the door, and examined the pen. It was heavier than it looked, intricately engraved, and possessed a minuscule, almost invisible mesh grill near the top. It was a military-grade audio recorder. Tonight's reservation for the private dining room was under the name Silas Mercer. Even Clara, disconnected from the criminal underworld, had heard whispers of the Mercer family. They controlled the concrete unions and the underground gambling rings in Queens. If Rossi was the undisputed king of the docks, Mercer was the wolf scratching at the city gates. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, Clara smoothed her apron and pushed a polished silver cart into the private dining room. Silas Mercer was a sharp, angular man with cold, reptilian eyes and a tailored navy suit. He sat at the head of the long table, accompanied by a man Clara instantly recognized from the front pages of the New York Times, Judge Harrison Sterling, a high-ranking state official known for his tough-on-crime public persona. Seeing them together, sharing a bottle of extremely rare Pappy Van Winkle bourbon, made Clara's blood run cold. "Gentlemen, good evening," Clara said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. "May I pour the sparkling water?" "Go ahead, sweetheart," Mercer drawled, not even glancing at her. He leaned in closer to the judge. "The waterfront zoning permits need to be delayed, Harrison. Rossi has 3 shipments of unregistered cargo coming into pier, 42 next Thursday. If you freeze the Harbour Union's operating license, his freighters can't dock." Clara approached the table, a crystal water pitcher in her right hand. With her left hand, she reached into her apron, retrieving the Mont Blanc pen. Her thumb pressed the silver clip twice. She felt a faint, singular vibration against her skin. The device was recording. As she poured the water for the judge, she feigned a slight clumsiness, allowing the pen to slip from her grasp. It clattered softly onto the mahogany table, rolling slightly before coming to a stop directly between Mercer's bourbon glass and the judge's bread plate. "Apologies," Clara whispered, bowing her head. "Leave it," Mercer snapped impatiently, waving her away. "Just get out and shut the door." Clara bowed again and quickly exited, pulling the heavy, soundproofed doors shut behind her. She stood in the hallway, her back pressed against the wall, breathing heavily. She had done it. But the true nightmare was yet to come. She had to go back in and retrieve it without being caught. For 2 agonizing hours, Clara served course after course, truffle risotto, Wagyu beef, imported caviar, all while the pen sat entirely unnoticed on the table, soaking up every damning word exchanged between the Mafia lieutenant and the corrupt judge. When it was time for the final espresso service, Clara walked back in. Mercer and Judge Sterling were laughing, thick cigar smoke filling the room. Clara cleared the heavy plates, her eyes locked on the pen. It had been moved. Mercer was now absent-mindedly tapping it against his knuckle as he spoke. Panic seized Clara's throat. If Mercer pocketed the pen, Rossi would kill her. "More espresso, Mr. Mercer?" Clara asked, stepping directly to his right side. Mercer paused, looking up at her. He set the pen down on the white linen tablecloth. "No, we're done here. Bring the check." "Right away, sir." Clara reached out with a cloth napkin to clear the breadcrumbs near his glass. In one fluid, practiced motion, honed by years of clearing cluttered tables in crowded diners, she swept the napkin over the pen, gripping it tightly within the fabric, and pulled her hand back. She turned and walked out of the room. The second the doors clicked shut, she leaned against the wall, her entire body shaking violently. She reached into the napkin. The pen was there. She pressed the clip once to stop the recording. She had survived her first night in the syndicate. The Obsidian Lincoln Navigator was waiting precisely where the Cadillac had been the night before, idling in the rain-slicked alleyway behind L'Epicure. This time, Clara didn't hesitate. She walked directly to the vehicle, pulled the heavy door open, and climbed inside. Silvio was driving. The partition between the front and rear was raised. Clara sat alone in the cavernous back seat, the Mont Blanc pen clutched so tightly in her fist that the metal-engraved pattern dug deep into her palm. The SUV glided silently through the midnight streets of Manhattan, turning onto the FDR Drive before heading toward the Upper East Side. They pulled into the subterranean parking garage of a towering, ultra-luxury glass skyscraper. Silvio opened the door for her, leading her to a private elevator that required a retinal scan to operate. When the elevator doors parted, Clara stepped out into a penthouse that defied comprehension. The entire western wall was floor-to-ceiling glass, offering a breathtaking, unobstructed view of Central Park and the glittering skyline. The floors were imported black marble, and the minimalist furniture likely cost more than a small suburban home. Dominic Rossi was standing by the glass wall, a crystal glass of amber liquid in his hand. He wore dark trousers and a crisp black dress shirt, the sleeves rolled up to the elbows, revealing forearms corded with muscle and faint, faded scars. He didn't turn around as she entered. "Did you secure the audio?" Clara walked forward, her footsteps echoing sharply on the marble. She placed the Mont Blanc pen on a massive glass-topped desk in the center of the room. "Yes, it's all there. Mercer and Judge Sterling. They're planning to freeze the Harbor Union's operating license to stop your shipments at Pier 42 next Thursday." Rossi finally turned. His slate-gray eyes swept over her, calculating and utterly unreadable. He walked to the desk, picked up the pen, and plugged it into a sleek silver laptop. He pressed play. The pristine, high-definition audio filled the penthouse. Mercer's gravelly voice and the judge's nervous agreements played out in perfect clarity. Rossi listened to the entire 2-hour recording in absolute, terrifying silence. Not a single muscle in his face twitched. He was a statue of pure, focused malice. When the recording finished, Rossi closed the laptop softly. "Flawless execution," Rossi said, his voice a low, smooth baritone. He walked over to a wet bar and poured a second glass of Macallan, bringing it over and offering it to Clara. "You have steady hands under pressure, Clara. You saved me a great deal of money and blood tonight." Clara didn't take the glass. "I did what you asked. Now, tell Arthur Callahan to back off. Cancel my brother's debt. Let me go back to my life." Rossi chuckled, a dark, velvet sound that sent a fresh wave of chills down Clara's spine. He set her glass down on the desk and leaned against the edge, crossing his arms. "Sit down, Clara," he commanded softly. "I prefer to stand." "Sit," he repeated. The word carried no volume, but the absolute authority behind it forced Clara to drop into the leather chair opposite him. "Your brother, Caleb, is a remarkable fool," Rossi began, staring down at her. "He didn't just steal $90,000 from my construction front. If that were the case, I would have just let Callahan break his kneecaps and be done with it. The money is nothing to me." Clara's stomach plummeted. "What did he do?" Rossi leaned forward, the physical distance between them closing, the scent of expensive bergamot cologne and dark liquor wrapping around her. "Caleb stole my encrypted shipping manifests. He stole the exact routes, times, and cargo contents of my syndicate's operations, and he sold them to Silas Mercer." Clara stopped breathing. "No, Caleb is a degenerate gambler, but he isn't suicidal. He wouldn't cross the Mafia." "He already did," Rossi said coldly. "He thought Mercer would protect him. He was wrong. Mercer took the manifests and locked your brother in a basement in Queens. Mercer has been using Caleb's access codes to intercept my shipments for the past month." "You're lying," Clara whispered, tears of denial finally spilling hot over her cheeks. "You're just saying this to keep me under your control." Rossi reached into his pocket, pulled out a heavy smartphone, and tossed it into Clara's lap. The screen was illuminated with a live video feed. Clara looked down and let out a choked gasp. It was a grainy security camera feed of a dark, concrete room. Tied to a metal chair in the center of the room was Caleb. His face was bruised, his clothes torn, and he looked terrified. "Mercer is holding him," Rossi stated, his eyes never leaving Clara's horrified face. "Once Mercer has drained every piece of intel from your brother's head, he will put a bullet in Caleb's skull and dump him in the East River. That is a fact, Clara." Clara clutched the phone, her hands shaking violently. "Please," she begged, looking up at the ruthless Mafia boss. "Please save him. You have the men. You have the guns. Get him out." "I am a businessman," Rossi repeated, his gaze heavy and possessive. "I do not risk my soldiers for a thief who betrayed me. However," Rossi reached out, his warm, calloused fingers gently brushing a stray tear from Clara's cheek. The touch was completely unexpected, gentle yet terrifyingly intimate. Clara froze, unable to pull away from his magnetic, predatory energy. "You proved your worth tonight," Rossi murmured, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You are invisible to them. Mercer is hosting a private gala at his estate in the Hamptons this weekend. L'Epicure is catering the event. You will be there." Clara stared into his slate-grey eyes, realizing the trap had just snapped completely shut. There was no escape. "You want me to steal the manifests back," she said, her voice hollow. "I want you to plant a tracker on Mercer's private server," Rossi corrected, a dark, approving smile playing on his lips. "You do this for me, Clara, and I will personally rip the doors off that basement and hand your brother back to you alive. But if you run or if you fail, Mercer kills Caleb, and I will ensure you spend the rest of your short life looking over your shoulder." Rossi stepped back, plunging his hands into his pockets. "Welcome to the deep end, Miss Hayes. Try not to drown." The Mercer estate in East Hampton was not merely a house, it was a fortress masquerading as a monument to unimaginable wealth. Situated on 12 sprawling acres overlooking the grey, churning waters of Georgica Pond, the compound was surrounded by 10-foot-high wrought-iron fences concealed by perfectly manicured privacy hedges. Security cameras tracked every angle, and men with military posture and concealed earpieces patrolled the perimeter. They were former private military contractors, bought and paid for by Silas Mercer's blood money. Clara Hayes sat rigidly in the back of the L'Epicure catering van as it rolled through the massive iron gates. She was dressed in the pristine white and black uniform of the catering staff, her dark hair pulled back into a severe, flawless chignon. Tucked securely inside the lining of her reinforced bra was a specialized piece of hardware Dominic Rossi had given her. A solid gold Cartier money clip that had been hollowed out and retrofitted with a military-grade localized network infiltrator. It didn't just track. Rossi's tech division had assured her it would create a back door into Mercer's private off-grid server, allowing Rossi's syndicate to strip the stolen shipping manifests and drain Mercer's offshore accounts simultaneously. "Listen up, everyone," Richard the maître d' barked from the front of the van, his face shining with a thin layer of anxious sweat. "Tonight is a 5-course tasting menu for 200 of the most powerful people on the eastern seaboard. Governors, senators, hedge fund managers. You do not speak unless spoken to. You do not drop a single crumb. If you embarrass me in front of Mr. Mercer, you will be walking back to Manhattan." Clara barely heard him. Her pulse was a frantic drumbeat in her ears. The ultimatum Rossi had laid out in his penthouse echoed endlessly in her mind. "If you run or if you fail, Mercer kills Caleb." The vans parked near the massive commercial-grade outdoor kitchen that had been erected specifically for the gala. The Hamptons' air was crisp, carrying the scent of salt water and expensive floral arrangements. The estate itself was a sprawling modern marvel of glass, steel, and imported Italian stone. For the first 3 hours of the gala, Clara played her part to absolute perfection. She became a ghost, carrying a silver tray. She wove through crowds of women dripping in Harry Winston diamonds and men wearing bespoke Tom Ford tuxedos. She poured endless flutes of vintage Dom Perignon, 2008, and served beluga caviar on mother-of-pearl spoons. She kept her eyes cast downward, but her peripheral vision was hyperactive. She mapped the estate. The ground floor was a sea of VIPs, a live jazz quartet, and overflowing champagne towers. But the second floor was restricted. A grand, sweeping glass staircase led upward, guarded by 2 massive men in dark suits who checked the face of anyone who even lingered too close to the bottom step. According to the blueprints Silvio had forced her to memorize the night before, Mercer's private study, and the physical server hub for his illicit operations, was on the 2nd floor at the end of the West Wing corridor. By 10:30 p.m., the main course, a meticulously plated duck confit, was being served in the grand ballroom. The guests were seated. The noise level had risen to a dull, wealthy roar, and the catering staff was moving at a frenetic pace in and out of the kitchen doors. It was the absolute height of the evening's chaos. It was Clara's only window. She grabbed a fresh, unopened bottle of Chateau Lafite Rothschild, draped a white linen cloth over her forearm, and walked purposefully away from the ballroom. Instead of heading back to the kitchen, she veered down a dimly lit side corridor that housed the estate's extensive art collection. Her heart hammered fiercely against her ribs as she approached a secondary, spiraling servant staircase that Silvio had identified, It was used by the maids and was supposed to be unguarded during the party. She pushed the discreet wooden door open. The stairwell was empty. Clara slipped inside, the heavy door clicking shut behind her, plunging her into immediate, terrifying silence. She kicked off her sensible black work shoes, holding them in her left hand, while gripping the neck of the wine bottle in her right like a club. In her stocking feet, she practically flew up the wooden stairs, taking them 2 at a time, terrified that a security patrol would open the door at any second. She reached the second-floor landing and slowly pressed the handle. The door opened a fraction of an inch. Clara peered through the crack. The West Wing corridor was lined with expensive Persian runners and antique credenzas, and standing exactly 20 feet away, directly in front of the heavy oak door that led to Mercer's study, was a single armed guard. Clara froze. Silvio's intelligence had been flawed. The study was guarded. Panic threatened to crush her lungs. She couldn't fight a trained mercenary. She had no weapon, no combat training, only a bottle of wine and a fake Cartier clip. If she went back downstairs, Caleb would die in that basement. If she stepped out, she would be caught, interrogated, and likely killed alongside him. She closed her eyes, took a deep, shuddering breath, and channeled the cold, ruthless energy of Dominic Rossi. "You are invisible to them," he had told her. "Use it." Clara slipped her shoes back on. She adjusted her apron, smoothed her hair, and pushed the door open, stepping out into the plush corridor. The guard's hand instantly went to the earpiece in his right ear, his other hand resting aggressively on the butt of the pistol holstered at his waist. "Hold it right there. This floor is entirely restricted. How did you get up here?" Clara didn't stop walking. She kept her pace brisk, her expression one of extreme, exasperated annoyance. Through the service stairs, obviously. Clara snapped, her voice dripping with an impressive imitation of a stressed, overworked waitress who had absolutely no time for his authority. She held up the incredibly rare bottle of wine. Mr. Mercer specifically demanded the Lafitte Rothschild be decanted in his private study away from the noise of the ballroom before he brings Judge Sterling upstairs for a private toast. If you want to go down there and tell him his $3,000 wine is sitting in the hallway because you wouldn't let me do my job, be my guest." The guard hesitated. He looked at her immaculate uniform, the pristine bottle of wine, and the sheer irritation on her face. He knew Silas Mercer's temper was legendary. Interrupting the boss during a massive gala to verify a wine delivery was a quick way to get fired, or worse. "Make it quick," the guard grunted, stepping aside and swiping a keycard over the biometric lock on the oak door. 2 minutes. I'm waiting right here." "Thank you," Clara said tightly, masking the violent trembling of her hands. She pushed open the heavy oak door and stepped into the viper's nest. Mercer's study was a monument to dark academia, mahogany walls, towering bookshelves, and a massive black marble desk. Behind the desk, blinking with a steady array of green and blue lights, was a state-of-the-art server rack, completely incongruous with the room's antique decor. Clara set the wine bottle on the desk. She reached into her uniform, her fingers desperately grasping the gold Cartier clip. She rushed around the desk, falling to her knees in front of the server rack. She found an open USB port on the primary terminal. With a shaking hand, she jammed the drive into the slot. Instantly, a small LED light on the clip flashed red, then solid blue. The infiltration had begun. Rossi's system was working. Clara stood up, smoothing her skirt, ready to walk out the door and disappear back into the catering staff. She had done it. She had saved Caleb. "I have to admit," a cold, gravelly voice echoed from the shadows of the room, "Rossi trains his rats very well. You barely even broke a sweat." Clara's blood turned to absolute ice. The air left her lungs in a violent rush. Stepping out from the darkened alcove near the floor-to-ceiling windows, holding a crystal glass of bourbon and a suppressed silver handgun, was Silas Mercer. Clara took a stumbling step backward until her spine hit the hard edge of the marble desk. The room began to spin. The guard outside hadn't been tricked. He had been instructed to let her in. It was a trap. Mercer had known all along. "You look surprised, Miss Hayes," Mercer sneered, taking a slow sip of his bourbon. He stepped fully into the light, his reptilian eyes filled with cruel amusement. Did Dominic really think I wouldn't recognize the waitress from L'Epicure? The same clumsy girl who just so happened to drop a recording device on my table while I was talking to Judge Sterling? I don't know what you're talking about," Clara lied, her voice cracking, her survival instincts desperately trying to hold the crumbling facade together. "Save the performance," Mercer snapped, the amusement dropping from his face, replaced by raw malice. He raised the suppressed pistol, pointing it directly at Clara's chest. Judge Sterling's security sweep found the encrypted transmission frequency bouncing off the restaurant's Wi-Fi. It didn't take a genius to review the security footage and see Rossi's new favorite toy clearing the table. "You think you're a spy? You're a pawn. And Dominic Rossi just sacrificed you." Mercer walked over to the heavy oak door and opened it. "Bring him in," he ordered. Two massive enforcers dragged a figure into the study, throwing him violently onto the expensive Persian rug. "Caleb!" Clara screamed, breaking forward before Mercer leveled the gun at her face, forcing her to freeze. Her older brother looked horrific. His face was a swollen mass of purple bruises, his lip was split open, and his clothes were stained with dried blood. He looked up at Clara, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and overwhelming guilt. "Clara! What are you doing here?" Caleb choked out, coughing violently. "I told you to pay Callahan. Why are you here?" "I'm here to fix your mess, you idiot," Clara sobbed, tears finally breaking free. Mercer laughed, walking over and kicking Caleb sharply in the ribs. Caleb groaned, curling into a tight ball. "Touching family reunion," Mercer mocked. He glanced over at the server rack, where the Cartier drive was still glowing a steady blue. "I assume that little piece of jewelry is Rossi's attempt to steal his shipping manifests back? Cute. I let you plug it in because this server is completely isolated. It's a honeypot, Clara. A fake drive. Rossi is currently downloading 2 terabytes of encrypted garbage." Mercer checked his heavy Patek Philippe watch. "In about 5 minutes, my men are going to take you and your degenerate brother out on my private boat. We're going to tie cinder blocks to your ankles, and you're going to explore the bottom of Georgica Pond. And tomorrow, I'm going to send Rossi the Cartier clip back, along with your severed fingers." Clara stared at Mercer. A heavy, suffocating blanket of despair washed over her. She had risked everything. She had entered the underworld to save her family, and instead she had delivered them both to their executioner. She closed her eyes, waiting for the end. But as she stood there, trembling, she noticed something. The steady blue light on the Cartier drive suddenly shifted. It blinked rapidly, violently red. If it's a fake server, Clara's mind raced. Why is it reacting? At that exact second, the lights in the study went out. It wasn't just the study. A collective gasp echoed from the grand ballroom downstairs as the entire 12-acre Hamptons estate was plunged into absolute pitch-black darkness. The jazz music died instantly. The security cameras outside powered down. The magnetic locks on the reinforced iron gates at the perimeter released with a loud metallic clack. Mercer cursed viciously in the dark. "Backup generators! Why didn't the backup generators kick in?" Clara dropped to the floor, crawling frantically toward her brother in the dark. "Get the flashlights," Mercer yelled to his guards. "Secure the girl." Before the guards could even reach into their pockets, the massive floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the balcony shattered inward in a spectacular explosion of glass. Chaos erupted. The sound of suppressed gunfire, rapid, quiet thwips filled the room. The two guards who had dragged Caleb in dropped to the floor instantly, incapacitated by highly trained operatives breaching through the darkness. Clara covered Caleb's body with her own, screaming as the glass rained down around them. The beams of high-powered tactical flashlights cut through the darkness, blinding and disorienting. Mercer fired blindly into the room, roaring in rage, but a massive figure stepped out of the shadows, cleanly disarming Mercer with a brutal strike to the wrist. The pistol clattered across the marble floor. The figure slammed Mercer against the bookshelf, pinning him by the throat. It was Silvio. The emergency lights finally flickered on, casting a dim, red glow over the ruined study. The heavy oak door creaked open. Stepping over the unconscious bodies of Mercer's guards, looking as impeccably tailored and utterly unbothered as the night they first met at L'Epicure, was Dominic Rossi. He wore a midnight blue suit, his slate-grey eyes scanning the absolute destruction he had just orchestrated with cold satisfaction. Rossi walked slowly past the bleeding, pinned Mercer, not even granting the rival boss a second glance. He stopped in front of the server rack, reached down, and casually plucked the gold Cartier clip from the terminal. "You arrogant son of a bitch!" Mercer spat, blood dripping from his chin as Silvio crushed his windpipe. "You think you won? That server is a dummy drive. You got nothing." Rossi finally turned, a slow, terrifying smile spreading across his face. "Silas, you really must learn to think 3 steps ahead," Rossi said, his voice smooth as velvet. "I knew you would recognize Clara. I knew Judge Sterling found the bug at the restaurant. I knew you would bring her up here, and I knew you would isolate this specific server, thinking you had outsmarted me." Rossi tossed the gold clip lightly in his hand. "This isn't a data extraction drive, Silas," Rossi revealed, his eyes turning lethal. "It's a military-grade EMP and a localized grid killer. I didn't send Clara here to steal my manifests back. I sent her here to plug this in, disable your $100 million security grid, open your front gates, and shut down your cameras so my men could walk into your compound completely undetected." Mercer's face drained of all color. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Clara hadn't been a spy. She had been a Trojan horse. "As for my manifests," Rossi continued softly, "while you were busy gloating in the dark, my team breached your primary vault in the basement. We have the physical drives. And as a penalty for your audacity, we also emptied the bearer bonds you kept in your safe. You are broke, Silas. And as soon as the police respond to the anonymous tip regarding the illegal firearms and narcotics we just planted in your ballroom, you will be spending the rest of your life in federal prison." Rossi nodded at Silvio. "Break his legs. Make sure he can't run when the sirens arrive." Silvio obliged with brutal, sickening efficiency. Mercer's screams were muffled by Silvio's heavy hand. Rossi turned his attention to the floor. Clara was still shielding her brother, her eyes wide, chest heaving. Rossi approached her, extending a hand. Clara hesitated for a fraction of a second before placing her trembling hand in his. His grip was firm, surprisingly warm, and he pulled her effortlessly to her feet. "You didn't tell me," Clara whispered, her voice shaking. "You used me as bait." "I used you as the queen on my board," Rossi corrected gently, stepping incredibly close to her, his thumb brushing a shard of glass from her shoulder. "And you played your part flawlessly. You didn't break. Even with a gun to your chest, you survived." He looked down at Caleb, who was groaning on the floor. Rossi's expression hardened into pure granite. "Caleb Hayes," Rossi said coldly, "your debt is forgiven. There is a private jet waiting at Teterboro Airport. It will take you to Zurich. You have a newly established account with $50,000 in it. If you ever return to the United States, or if you ever attempt to contact your sister again, I will not send Arthur Callahan. I will come for you myself. Do you understand?" Caleb nodded frantically, tears streaming down his bruised face. "Yes. Yes, I understand," Rossi signaled to two of his men. "Get him out of here." As Caleb was dragged away, Clara felt a sudden, profound shift in her reality. The crippling debt, the loan sharks, the dingy apartment, the 14-hour shifts serving arrogant politicians, all of it was gone. But as she looked up at the terrifying, brilliant, and utterly ruthless man standing before her, she realized she hadn't escaped the underworld. She had just been elevated to the top of it. "What happens to me now?" Clara asked softly, the fear in her voice entirely replaced by a dark, magnetic curiosity. Dominic Rossi offered her his arm, the sirens of the approaching police cruisers just beginning to wail in the distance. "Now, Miss Hayes," Rossi said, his eyes burning with a possessive, intense fire. "We go home. You are done pouring wine." The truth about the criminal underworld is that power isn't always inherited. Sometimes it's seized by a waitress holding a ruined bottle of wine. Clara Hayes entered Silas Mercer's fortress as a desperate pawn, but she walked out as the most dangerous piece on Dominic Rossi's chessboard. She didn't just save her brother Caleb's life and erase a crushing $90,000 debt. She orchestrated the total collapse of a rival Mafia empire without ever firing a single weapon. Rossi's ruthless gamble paid off, and the silent, terrifying chemistry between the cartel boss and the waitress has now ignited into an undeniable partnership. Clara's old life in that cramped Astoria apartment is officially dead, but her reign alongside the king of the New York Syndicate has only just begun. If you were blown away by this unbelievable Mafia twist, smash that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to the channel right now for more incredible stories.